We must now consider Christian morality as regards sex, what Christians call the virtue of chastity. The Christian rule of chastity must not be confused with the social rule of modesty in one sense of that word, i.e., propriety or decency. The social rule of propriety lays down how much of the human body should be displayed and what subjects can be referred to, and in what words, according to the customs of a given social circle. Thus, while the rule of chastity is the same for all Christians at all times, the rule of propriety changes. A girl in the Pacific Islands wearing hardly any clothes and a Victorian lady completely covered in clothes might both be equally modest, proper, or decent, according to the standards of their own societies. And both, for all we could tell by their dress, might be equally chaste or equally unchaste. Some of the language which chaste women used in Shakespeare's time would have been used in the 19th century only by a woman completely abandoned. When people break the rule of propriety, current in their own time and place, if they do so in order to excite lust in themselves or others, then they are offending against chastity. But if they break it through ignorance or carelessness, they are guilty only of bad manners. When, as often happens, they break it defiantly in order to shock or embarrass others, they are not necessarily being chaste, but they are being uncharitable. For it is uncharitable to take pleasure in making other people uncomfortable. I do not think that a very strict or fussy standard of propriety is any proof of chastity or any help to it, and I therefore regard the great relaxation and simplifying of the rule which has taken place in my own lifetime as a good thing. At its present stage, however, it has this inconvenience that people of different ages and different types do not all acknowledge the same standard, and we hardly know where we are. While this confusion lasts, I think that old or old-fashioned people should be very careful not to assume that young or emancipated people are corrupt whenever they are, by the old standard, improper, and in return that young people should not call their elders prudes or Puritans because they do not easily adopt the new standard. A real desire to believe all the good you can of others and to make others as comfortable as you can will solve most of the problems. Chastity is the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. There is no getting away from it. The old Christian rule is either marriage with complete faithfulness to your partner or else total abstinence. Now this is so difficult and so contrary to our instincts that obviously either Christianity is wrong or our sexual instinct, as it now is, has gone wrong, one or the other. Of course, being a Christian, I think it is the instinct which has gone wrong. But I have other reasons for thinking so. The biological purpose of sex is children, just as the biological purpose of eating is to repair the body. Now, if we eat whenever we feel inclined and just as much as we want, it is quite true that most of us will eat too much, but not terrifically too much. One man may eat enough for 2, but he does not eat enough for 10. The appetite goes a little beyond its biological purpose, but not enormously. But if a healthy young man indulged his sexual appetite whenever he felt inclined, and if each act produced a baby, then in 10 years he might easily populate a small village. This appetite is in ludicrous and preposterous excess of its function. Or take it another way. You can get a large audience together for a strip tease act. That is, to watch a girl undress on the stage. Now suppose you came to a country where you could fill a theatre by simply bringing a covered plate onto the stage and then slowly lifting the cover so as to let everyone see just before the lights went out that it contained a mutton chop or a bit of bacon. Would you not think that in that country something had gone wrong with the appetite for food? And would not anyone who had grown up in a different world think there was something equally queer about the state of the sex instinct among us? One critic said that if he found a country in which such striptease acts with food were popular, he would conclude that the people of that country were starving. He meant, of course, to imply that such things as the striptease act resulted not from sexual corruption, but from sexual starvation. I agree with him that if, in some strange land, we found that similar acts with mutton chops were popular, one of the possible explanations which would occur to me would be famine. But the next step would be to test our hypothesis by finding out whether, in fact, much or little food was being consumed in that country. If the evidence showed that a good deal was being eaten, then, of course, we should have to abandon the hypothesis of starvation and try to think of another one. In the same way, before accepting sexual starvation as the cause of the striptease, we should have to look for evidence that there is, in fact, more sexual abstinence in our age than in those ages when things like the striptease were unknown. But surely there is no such evidence. Contraceptives have made sexual indulgence far less costly within marriage and far safer outside it than ever before, and public opinion is less hostile to illicit unions and even to perversion than it has been since pagan times. Nor is the hypothesis of starvation the only one we can imagine. Everyone knows that the sexual appetite, like our other appetites, grows by indulgence. Starving men may think much about food, but so do gluttons, the gorged as well as the famished, like titillations. Here's a third point. You find very few people who want to eat things that really are not food, or to do other things with food instead of eating it. In other words, perversions of the food appetite are rare, but perversions of the sex instinct are numerous, hard to cure, and frightful. I am sorry to have to go into all these details, but I must. The reason why I must is that you and I, for the last 20 years, have been fed all day long on good, solid lies about sex. We have been told, till one is sick of hearing it, that sexual desire is in the same state as any of our other natural desires, and that if only we abandon the silly old Victorian idea of hushing it up, everything in the garden will be lovely. It is not true. The moment you look at the facts and away from the propaganda, you see that it is not. They tell you sex has become a mess because it was hushed up. But for the last 20 years, it has not been hushed up. It has been chattered about all day long. Yet, it is still in a mess. If hushing up had been the cause of the trouble, ventilation would have set it right. But it has not. I think it is the other way round. I think the human race originally hushed it up because it had become such a mess. Modern people are always saying, sex is nothing to be ashamed of. They may mean two things. They may mean there is nothing to be ashamed of in the fact that the human race reproduces itself in a certain way, nor in the fact that it gives pleasure. If they mean that, they are right. Christianity says the same. It is not the thing nor the pleasure that is the trouble. The old Christian teachers said that if man had never fallen, sexual pleasure, instead of being less than it is now, would actually have been greater. I know some muddle-headed Christians have talked as if Christianity thought that sex, or the body, or pleasure were bad in themselves. But they were wrong. Christianity is almost the only one of the great religions which thoroughly approves of the body, which believes that matter is good, that God himself once took on a human body, that some kind of body is going to be given to us even in heaven, and is going to be an essential part of our happiness, our beauty, and our energy. Christianity has glorified marriage more than any other religion, and nearly all the greatest love poetry in the world has been produced by Christians. If anyone says that sex in itself is bad, Christianity contradicts him at once. But of course, when people say sex is nothing to be ashamed of, they may mean the state into which the sexual instinct has now got is nothing to be ashamed of. If they mean that, I think they are wrong. I think it is everything to be ashamed of. There is nothing to be ashamed of in enjoying your food. There would be everything to be ashamed of if half the world made food the main interest of their lives and spent their time looking at pictures of food and dribbling and smacking their lips. I do not say you and I are individually responsible for the present situation. Our ancestors have handed over to us organisms which are warped in this respect, and we grow up surrounded by propaganda in favor of unchastity. There are people who want to keep our sex instinct inflamed in order to make money out of us. Because, of course, a man with an obsession is a man who has very little sales resistance. God knows our situation. He will not judge us as if we had no difficulties to overcome. What matters is the sincerity and perseverance of our will to overcome them. Before we can be cured, we must want to be cured. Those who really wish for help will get it. But for many modern people, even the wish is difficult. It is easy to think that we want something when we do not really want it. A famous Christian long ago told us that when he was a young man, he prayed constantly for chastity. But years later he realized that while his lips had been saying, "O Lord, make me chaste," his heart had been secretly adding, "But please, don't do it just yet." This may happen in prayers for other virtues too, but there are three reasons why it is now specially difficult for us to desire, let alone to achieve, complete chastity. In the first place, our warped natures, the devils who tempt us, and all the contemporary propaganda for lust, combine to make us feel that the desires we are resisting are so natural, so healthy, and so reasonable that it is all most perverse and abnormal to resist them. Poster after poster, film after film, novel after novel, associate the idea of sexual indulgence with the ideas of health, normality, youth, frankness, and good humor. Now, this association is a lie. Like all powerful lies, it is based on a truth, the truth, acknowledged above, that sex in itself, apart from the excesses and obsessions that have grown round it, is normal and healthy, and all the rest of it. The lie consists in the suggestion that any sexual act to which you are tempted at the moment is also healthy and normal. Now this, on any conceivable view, and quite apart from Christianity, must be nonsense. Surrender to all our desires obviously leads to impotence, disease, jealousies, lies, concealment, and everything that is the reverse of health, good humor, and frankness. For any happiness, even in this world, quite a lot of restraint is going to be necessary. So the claim made by every desire, when it is strong, to be healthy and reasonable, counts for nothing. Every sane and civilized man must have some set of principles by which he chooses to reject some of his desires and to permit others. One man does this on Christian principles, another on hygienic principles, another on sociological principles. The real conflict is not between Christianity and nature, but between Christian principle and other principles in the control of nature. For nature, in the sense of natural desire, will have to be controlled anyway, unless you're going to ruin your whole life. The Christian principles are, admittedly, stricter than the others. But then we think you will get help towards obeying them, which you will not get towards obeying the others. In the second place, many people are deterred from seriously attempting Christian chastity because they think, before trying, that it is impossible. But when a thing has to be attempted, one must never think about possibility or impossibility. Faced with an optional question in an examination paper, one considers whether one can do it or not. Faced with a compulsory question, one must do the best one can. You may get some marks for a very imperfect answer. You will certainly get none for leaving the question alone. Not only in examinations, but in war, in mountain climbing, in learning to skate or swim or ride a bicycle, even in fastening a stiff collar with cold fingers, people quite often do what seemed impossible before they did it. It is wonderful what you can do when you have to. We may indeed be sure that perfect chastity, like perfect charity, will not be attained by any merely human efforts. You must ask for God's help. Even when you have done so, it may seem to you for a long time that no help, or less help than you need, is being given. Never mind. After each failure, ask forgiveness, pick yourself up and try again. Very often what God first helps us towards is not the virtue itself, but just this power of always trying again. For however important chastity or courage or truthfulness or any other virtue may be, this process trains us in habits of the soul, which are more important still. It cures our illusions about ourselves and teaches us to depend on God. We learn, on the one hand, that we cannot trust ourselves even in our best moments, and on the other, that we need not despair even in our worst, for our failures are forgiven. The only fatal thing is to sit down, content, with anything less than perfection. Thirdly, people often misunderstand what psychology teaches about repressions. It teaches us that repressed sex is dangerous, but repressed is here a technical term. It does not mean suppressed in the sense of denied or resisted. A repressed desire or thought is one which has been thrust into the subconscious, usually at a very early age, and can now come before the mind only in a disguised and unrecognizable form. Repressed sexuality does not appear to the patient to be sexuality at all. When an adolescent or an adult is engaged in resisting a conscious desire, he is not dealing with a repression, nor is he in the least danger of creating a repression. On the contrary, those who are seriously attempting chastity are more conscious and soon know a great deal more about their own sexuality than anyone else. They come to know their desires as Wellington knew Napoleon, or as Sherlock Holmes knew Moriarty, as a rat catcher knows rats, or a plumber knows about leaky pipes. Virtue, even attempted virtue, brings light. Indulgence brings fog. Finally, though I have had to speak at some length about sex, I want to make it as clear as I possibly can that the center of Christian morality is not here. If anyone thinks that Christians regard chastity as the supreme vice, he's quite wrong. The sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least bad of all sins. All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual. The pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, of bossing and patronizing and spoiling sport, and backbiting, the pleasures of power, of hatred. For there are two things inside me, competing with the human self, which I must try to become. They are the animal self and the diabolical self. The diabolical self is the worst of the two. That is why a cold, self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. But of course, it is better to be neither. I see you won't let me off, and the longer I look at it, the less I shall like it. I must face, or else explicitly decline, the difficulties that really torment us when we cry for mercy in earnest. I have found no book that helps me with them all. I have so little confidence in my own power to tackle them that if it were possible, I would let sleeping dogs lie. But the dogs are not sleeping. They are awake and snapping. We both bear the marks of their teeth. That being so, we had better share our bewilderments. By hiding them from each other, we should not hide them from ourselves. The New Testament contains embarrassing promises that what we pray for with faith, we shall receive. Mark of Things 24 is the most staggering. Whatever we ask for, believing that we'll get it, we'll get. No question, it seems, of confining it to spiritual gifts, whatever we ask for. No question of a merely general faith in God, but a belief that you will get the particular thing you ask. No question of getting either it or else something that is really far better for you. You'll get precisely it. And to heap paradox on paradox, the Greek doesn't even say believing that you will get it. It uses the aorist Greek elabit, which one is tempted to translate believing that you got it. But this final difficulty I shall ignore. I don't expect Aramaic had anything which we, brought up on Latin grammar, would recognize as tenses at all. How is this astonishing promise to be reconciled? A, with the observed facts. B, with the prayer in Gethsemane, and as a result of that prayer, the universally accepted view that we should ask everything with a reservation, if it be thy will. As regards A, no evasion is possible. Every war, every famine or plague, almost every deathbed is the monument to a petition that was not granted. At this very moment, thousands of people in this one island are facing as a fate accompli, the very thing against which they have prayed night and day, pouring out their whole soul in prayer, and, as they thought, with faith. They have sought and not found. They have knocked, and it has not been opened. That which they greatly feared has come upon them. But B, though much less often mentioned, is surely an equal difficulty. How is it possible at one and the same moment to have a perfect faith, an untroubled or unhesitating faith, as St. James says, that you will get what you ask, and yet also prepare yourself submissively in advance for a possible refusal? If you envisage a refusal as possible, how can you have simultaneously a perfect confidence that what you ask will not be refused? If you have that confidence, how can you take refusal into account at all? It is easy to see why so much more is written about worship and contemplation than about crudely or naively petitionary prayer. They may be, I think they are, nobler forms of prayer. But they are also a good deal easier to write about. As regards the first difficulty, I'm not asking why our petitions are so often refused. Anyone can see in general that this must be so. In our ignorance, we ask what is not good for us or for others, or not even intrinsically possible. Or again, to grant one man's prayer involves refusing another's. There is much here which it is hard for our will to accept, but nothing that is hard for our intellect to understand. The real problem is different. Not why refusal is so frequent, but why the opposite result is so lavishly promised. Shall we then proceed on Wedler's principles and scrap the embarrassing promises as venerable archaisms which have to be outgrown? Surely, even if there were no other objection, that method is too easy. If we are free to delete all inconvenient data, we shall certainly have no theological difficulties. But for the same reason, no solutions and no progress. The very writers of the techies, not to mention the scientists, know better. The troublesome fact, the apparent absurdity which can't be fitted into any synthesis we have yet made, is precisely the one we must not ignore. 10 to 1, it's in that covert the fox is lurking. There is always hope if we keep an unsolved problem fairly in view. There's none if we pretend it's not there. Before going any further, I want to make two purely practical points. 1. These lavish promises are the worst possible place at which to begin Christian instruction in dealing with a child or a pagan. You remember what happened when the widow started Huck Finn off with the idea he could get what he wanted by praying for it. He tried the experiment and then, not unnaturally, never gave Christianity a second thought. We had better not talk about the view of prayer embodied in Mark the Fiend 24 as naive or elementary. If that passage contains a truth, it is a truth for very advanced pupils indeed. I don't think it is addressed to our condition, yours and mine, at all. It is a coping stone, not a foundation. For most of us, the prayer in Gethsemane is the only model. Removing mountains can wait. 2. We must not encourage in ourselves or others any tendency to work up a subjective state, which, if we succeeded, we should describe as faith, with the idea that this will somehow ensure the granting of our prayer. We have probably all done this as children, but the state of mind which desperate desire working on a strong imagination can manufacture is not faith in the Christian sense. It is a feat of psychological gymnastics. It seems to me we must conclude that such promises about prayer with faith refer to a degree or kind of faith which most believers never experience. A far inferior degree is, I hope, acceptable to God, even the kind that says, "Help thou my unbelief," may make way for a miracle. Again, the absence of such faith as ensures the granting of the prayer is not even necessarily a sin, for our Lord had no such assurance when he prayed in Gethsemane. How or why does such faith occur? Sometimes, but not always, even in the perfect petitioner. We, or I, can only guess. My own idea is that it occurs only when the one who prays does so as God's fellow worker, demanding what is needed for the joint work. It is the prophets, the apostles, the missionaries, the healers' prayer that is made with this confidence and finds the confidence justified by the event. The difference, we are told, between a servant and a friend is that a servant is not in his master's secrets. For him, orders is orders. He has only his own surmises as to the plans he helps to execute. But the fellow worker, the companion, or, dare we say, The colleague of God is so united with him at certain moments that something of the divine foreknowledge enters his mind. Hence his faith is the evidence, that is, the evidentness, the obviousness of things not seen. As the friend is above the servant is above the suitor, the man praying on his own behalf. It is no sin to be a suitor. Our Lord descends into the humiliation of being a suitor, of praying on his own behalf in Gethsemane. But when he does so, the certitude about his Father's will is apparently withdrawn. After that, it would be no true faith. It would be idle presumption for us, who are habitually suitors and do not often rise to the level of servants, to imagine that we shall have any assurance which is not an illusion, or correct only by accident, about the event of our prayers. Our struggle is, isn't it, to achieve and retain faith on a lower level, to believe that whether he can grant them or not, God will listen to our prayers, will take them into account. Even to go on believing that there is a listener at all, for as the situation grows more and more desperate, the grisly fears intrude. Are we only talking to ourselves in an empty universe? The silence is often so emphatic, and we have prayed so much already. What do you think about these things? I have offered only guesses. My experience is the same as yours. I have never met a book on prayer which was much use to people in our position. There are many little books of prayers which may be helpful to those who share Rose Macaulay's approach, but you and I wouldn't know what to do with them. It's not words we lack. And there are books on prayer, but they nearly all have a strongly conventional background. Even the imitation is sometimes, to an almost comic degree, not addressed to my condition. The author assumes that you will want to be chatting in the kitchen when you ought to be in your cell. Our temptation is to be in our studies when we ought to be chatting in the kitchen. Perhaps if our studies were as cold as those cells, it would be different. You and I are people of the foothills. In the happy days when I was still a walker, I loved the hills and even mountain walks, but I was no climber. I hadn't the head, so now I do not attempt the precipices of mysticism. On the other hand, there is apparently a level of prayer life lower even than ours. I don't mean that the people who occupy it are spiritually lower than we. They may far excel us, but their praying is of an astonishingly undeveloped type. I have only just learned about it from our vicar. He assures me that, so far as he has been able to discover, the overwhelming majority of his parishioners mean by saying their prayers, repeating whatever little formula they were taught in childhood by their mothers. I wonder how this can come about. It can't be that they are never penitent or thankful. They're dear people, many of them, or have no needs. Is it that there is a sort of watertight bulkhead between their religion and their real life, in which case the part of their life which they call religious is really the irreligious part? But however badly needed a good book on prayer is, I shall never try to write it. Two people on the foothills comparing notes in private are all very well, but in a book one would inevitably seem to be attempting not discussion, but instruction. And for me to offer the world instruction about prayer would be impudence about the higher level, the crags up, which the mystics vanish out of my sight. the glaciers and the aiguilles, I have only two things to say. One is that I don't think we are all called to that ascent. If it were so, he would have told us. The second is this. The following position is gaining ground and is extremely plausible. Mystics, it is said, starting from the most diverse religious premises, all find the same things. These things have singularly little to do with the professed doctrines of any particular religion. Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Neoplatonism, etc. Therefore, mysticism is, by empirical evidence, the only real contact man has ever had with the unseen. The agreement of the explorers proves that they are all in touch with something objective. It is therefore the one true religion. And what we call the religions are either mere delusions, or at best, so many porches through which an entrance into transcendent reality can be effected. And when he hath the kernel eat, who doth not throw away the shell? I am doubtful about the premises. Did Plotinus and Lady Julian and St. John of the Cross really find the same things? But even admitting some similarity, one thing common to all mysticisms is the temporary shattering of our ordinary spatial and temporal consciousness and of our discursive intellect. The value of this negative experience must depend on the nature of that positive, whatever it is, for which it makes room. But should we not expect that the negative would always feel the same? If wine glasses were conscious, I suppose that being emptied would be the same experience for each, even if some were to remain empty and some to be filled with wine and some broken. All who leave the land and put to sea will find the same things, the land sinking below the horizon, the gulls dropping behind the salty breeze. Tourists, merchants, sailors, pirates, missionaries, it's all one. But this identical experience vouches for nothing about the utility or lawfulness or final event of their voyages. It may be that the gulfs will wash them down. It may be they will touch the happy isles. I do not at all regard mystical experience as an illusion. I think it shows that there is a way to go before death, out of what may be called this world, out of the stage set, out of this, but into what? That's like asking an Englishman, where does the sea lead to? He will reply, to everywhere on earth, including Davy Jones's locker, except England. The lawfulness, safety, and utility of the mystical voyage depends not at all on its being mystical, that is, on its being a departure, but on the motives, skill, and constancy of the voyager, and on the grace of God. The true religion gives value to its own mysticism. Mysticism does not validate the religion in which it happens to occur. I shouldn't be at all disturbed if it could be shown that a diabolical mysticism or drugs produced experiences indistinguishable by introspection from those of the great Christian mystics. Departures are all alike. It is the landfall that crowns the voyage. The saint, by being a saint, proves that his mysticism, if he was a mystic, not all saints are, led him aright. The fact that he has practiced mysticism could never prove his sanctity. You may wonder that my intense desire to peep behind the scenes has not led me to attempt the mystic way. But would it not be the worst of all possible motives? The saint may win a mortal glimpse of death's immortal rose, but it is a byproduct. He took ship simply in humble and selfless love. There can be a desire like mine, with no carnal element in it at all, which is nevertheless, in St. Paul's sense, flesh. and not spirit. That is, there can be a merely impulsive, headstrong, greedy desire, even for spiritual things, like our other appetites, cross-fodder. Yet, being crucified, it can be raised from the dead and made part of our bliss. Turning now to quite a different point in your letter. I too had noticed that our prayers for others flow more easily than those we offer on our own behalf, and it would be nice to accept your view that this just shows we are made to live by charity. I'm afraid, however, I detect two much less attractive reasons for the ease of my own intercessory prayers. One is that I am often, I believe, praying for others when I should be doing things for them. It's so much easier to pray for a bore than to go and see him, and the other is like unto it. Suppose I pray that you may be given grace to withstand your besetting sin. Short list of candidates for this post will be forward on demand. Well, all the work has to be done by God and you. If I pray against my own besetting sin, there will be work for me. One sometimes fights shy of admitting an act to be a sin for this very reason. The increasing list of people to be prayed for is, nevertheless, one of the burdens of old age. I have a scruple about crossing anyone off the list. When I say a scruple, I mean precisely a scruple. I don't really think that if one prays for a man at all, it is a duty to pray for him all my life. But when it comes to dropping him now this particular day, it somehow goes against the grain. And as the list lengthens, it is hard to make it more than a mere string of names. But here, in some measure, a curious law comes into play. Don't you find that if you keep your mind fixed upon God, you will automatically think of the person you are praying for, but that there's no tendency for it to work the other way round?